I remember the sound of rain against the hospital window, the day they told me I would need the surgery. Soft, persistent drops that seemed to count down the hours until my life would change forever. I was 73 years old, and my hip had finally given up after carrying me through 7 decades of living, working, loving, and losing. The doctor's voice was kind but clinical as he explained the procedure, the recovery time, the need for assistance during those first crucial weeks. I nodded, taking it all in, and my first thought wasn't about the pain or the risk. It was about my daughter, Rebecca, and how I would tell her I needed help. You see, Rebecca was my only child, the light that came into my life 46 years ago on a Tuesday morning in spring when the cherry blossoms were blooming outside the maternity ward. Her father, my William, had held her with such tenderness, such absolute wonder, that I knew in that moment our family was complete. We didn't need anything else in this world but each other. William worked at the post office for 38 years, coming home every evening with his uniform neat and his hands smelling of paper and ink. I worked as a seamstress, my fingers nimble and quick, stitching together other people's special occasions while building our own quiet life. We weren't wealthy, but we were rich in ways that mattered. Sunday dinners around our small oak table, Rebecca's laughter echoing through our modest 2-bedroom house. William's arm around my waist as we watched our daughter grow into a beautiful, intelligent young woman. When Rebecca met Marcus during her second year of college, I tried to be happy. I really did. He was handsome in that polished way, with perfect teeth and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. He came from money, the kind of family that vacationed in places I couldn't pronounce, and I could see how Rebecca's eyes lit up when he talked about his future plans, his business ventures, his ambitions. William was more skeptical. He would sit in his armchair after they left from dinner, rubbing his chin the way he did when something troubled him. "There's something hollow there," he once told me, his voice barely above a whisper. Like he's saying all the right words but none of them have roots. I squeezed his hand and told him to give Marcus time, that people can surprise you, that love can soften the sharpest edges. How I wish I had listened to William's instincts, instead of my desperate hope that my daughter had found her happiness. They married 3 months after Rebecca graduated, a lavish wedding that Marcus's family paid for, an event so grand and impersonal that I barely recognized my own daughter beneath the layers of silk and diamonds. William and I sat at our assigned table, smiling for photographs, feeling like guests at a stranger's celebration. That was the beginning of the distance, though I didn't recognize it then. After the wedding, Rebecca and Marcus moved to the other side of town, into a house with columns and a circular driveway, and suddenly our Sunday dinners became monthly obligations, then holidays only, then increasingly rare appearances accompanied by excuses about schedules and commitments and important social functions. William died 4 years ago, on an autumn afternoon so beautiful it seemed cruel. A heart attack while raking leaves in our backyard, beneath the maple tree we had planted when Rebecca was born. He was there one moment, alive and humming an old song, and gone the next, collapsed among the red and gold leaves like he had simply laid down to rest. Rebecca came to the funeral with Marcus, both dressed in expensive black, both checking their phones periodically during the service. She hugged me, but it felt performative, like an actress playing the role of a grieving daughter. Marcus shook hands with the mourners, and spoke about what a good man William was, though he had barely known him, had barely tried to know him. After they buried my husband, after everyone left and the house filled with that terrible silence that only exists when someone who loved you is gone forever, I sat alone in William's armchair and wept until I had no tears left. The years after William's death were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. The loneliness was crushing, a physical weight that settled on my chest each morning when I woke to an empty bed. I tried to reach out to Rebecca, calling her weekly, inviting her for coffee, for lunch, for just a brief visit to remind us both that we were still family. She was always busy. Always had somewhere else to be. Marcus's business was expanding. They were remodeling the kitchen. They had committed to a charity gala, a golf tournament, a weekend trip with his colleagues. I told myself it was temporary, that she would come around. that the demands of her life would ease and she would remember her mother who sat alone in a quiet house, counting the days between phone calls. Then came the fall. Stupid. Really, how quickly everything can change. I was reaching for a serving platter on the top shelf of my kitchen cabinet, standing on a stool that had grown wobbly with age, just like me. The stool tipped, I lost my balance, and I went down hard on the kitchen tile, my hip connecting with the floor with a sound like a branch breaking. The pain was immediate and absolute, radiating through my body in waves that made me gasp and cry out to an empty house. I managed to reach my phone and call for help, but lying there on that cold floor, waiting for the ambulance, all I could think about was William, and how he would have been there, how he would have held my hand, and told me everything would be all right. How I would never have been alone in the first place. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks later, after the swelling went down, after the doctors ran their tests and made their assessments. I called Rebecca from my hospital bed, my voice shaking slightly as I explained what happened, what needed to happen next, and what the doctor had said about the recovery period. I would need help for the first 4 to 6 weeks, someone to assist me with basic tasks, to make sure I was eating, taking my medications, doing the physical therapy exercises that would determine whether I walked normally again, or spent the rest of my life shuffling around with a walker. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched too long, and then Rebecca's voice, tight and measured, said, "Of course, Mom. We'll figure something out." The surgery itself is a blur in my memory, a haze of anesthesia and beeping machines and nurses with kind faces telling me to breathe, to count backwards, to let go. When I woke, the pain was different, deeper, accompanied by a fog that made my thoughts slow and disconnected. Rebecca was there in the recovery room, sitting in the chair by the window, scrolling through her phone with her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen. When she noticed I was awake, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The doctor says it went well," she told me. "You'll be able to come home tomorrow." Home. I had assumed I would be going to her home, to the house with the columns and the guest rooms, that were always prepared for Marcus's business associates but never for me. Instead, Rebecca drove me back to my own small house, the one I had shared with William, the one where every corner held a memory and every room owed with absence. Marcus helped me inside, his hands impersonal and efficient as he guided me to the couch, and then they both stood in my living room looking uncomfortable, like strangers who had completed a task and were eager to leave. "We'll check on you," Rebecca said, already moving toward the door. "Call if you need anything serious." And then they were gone, the sound of Marcus's expensive car fading down the street, and I was alone again, unable to walk to the bathroom without excruciating pain, unable to reach the kitchen to make myself a meal, unable to do anything but sit on that couch and wonder how my life had come to this. The first few days were a nightmare. I slept on the couch because I couldn't manage the stairs to my bedroom. I survived on crackers and water that I had set within reach before Rebecca left, rationing them like a castaway on an island. The pain medication made me dizzy and nauseous, but without it the agony in my hip was unbearable. I called Rebecca on the second day, my voice weak and pleading in a way that shamed me, asking if she could please come by, bring some groceries, help me to the bathroom, just be there for a few hours. She arrived late that afternoon with Marcus, both of them looking annoyed, carrying a single bag of groceries that they deposited on my kitchen counter. "Mom, we have lives," Marcus said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "We can't just drop everything every time you need something." Rebecca didn't disagree with him, didn't defend me, just stood there looking at her shoes while her husband told her mother that she was an inconvenience. They left after 20 minutes. I managed to drag myself to the bathroom, then back to the couch, sobbing with pain and humiliation, and that's when I truly understood that I was on my own. The daughter I had raised, had loved with every cell in my body, had sacrificed for and worried over and celebrated, saw me as a burden. Marcus had convinced her that her mother's needs were unreasonable, that caring for the woman who had given her life was somehow an imposition on their carefully curated existence. And Rebecca, my sweet Rebecca who used to climb into my lap when she was small and tell me I was the best mama in the whole world, had chosen him over me. The days blurred together. A neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, noticed my newspapers piling up and came to check on me. She was horrified at the state she found me in, unwashed, in pain, barely able to function. She started coming by twice a day, bringing soup, helping me with basic care, calling the physical therapist to start my exercises. She was a widow herself, her children lived across the country, and she understood the particular loneliness of aging without anyone who felt obligated to care. We became allies in survival. 2 old women helping each other navigate the indignities of bodies that no longer cooperated and children who had forgotten where they came from. 3 weeks after the surgery, Rebecca called to say they were coming over. She sounded different, her voice carrying a note of rehearsed casualness that immediately put me on alert. They arrived together, Marcus in his expensive suit despite it being a Saturday, Rebecca in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly pension. They sat across from me, on the chairs that had once been part of our family game nights, and Marcus cleared his throat in that important way he had when he was about to make a pronouncement. "We've been thinking," he began. And I knew before he said another word that whatever came next would break my heart. "This house is too much for you. You can't handle the maintenance, the stairs, living alone. We think it's time to consider assisted living." Assisted living. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This house, where I had brought Rebecca home as a newborn, where William and I had built our life, where every wall held our history, they wanted to take it from me, to put me away in some facility where I would die among strangers, my memories boxed up and forgotten. "I can manage," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Mrs. Patterson helps me. I'm getting better every day. I don't need to leave my home." Marcus leaned forward, his face a practiced expression of concern. "Be realistic. You fell once. You'll fall again. You're becoming a liability. We can't be running over here every time something happens." I looked at my daughter, silently begging her to remember who I was, who she was, what we had been to each other. But Rebecca just nodded along with her husband, her eyes anywhere but on my face. "I'm not leaving my home," I said firmly. "This is where I belong. This is where your father and I lived. This is where you grew up." Marcus's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the irritation beneath. "Your father is dead, Rebecca's moved on, and you're being stubborn. We're trying to help you." The words were like a slap, delivered with such casual cruelty that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice small and defensive. "Mum, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're just thinking about what's best." And there it was, the final betrayal. My daughter, speaking to me like I was a child, like my feelings and wishes and lifetime of devotion meant nothing compared to their convenience. I asked them to leave. My voice was calm but my hands were shaking with rage and grief. Marcus stood immediately, clearly relieved to be dismissed, but Rebecca hesitated, something flickering across her face that might have been guilt or regret, or just discomfort at the scene she was creating. "Mom," she started, but I cut her off. "Go. Just go." And they did, leaving me alone in the house they wanted to take from me, in the life they had already mentally packed away and discarded. That night, unable to sleep, I sat in William's armchair and made a decision. I called my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who had handled our simple affairs for years, and told him I needed to change my will. Everything I owned. The house, the small savings account William and I had built, the few pieces of jewelry that had been passed down through my family. I left it all to Mrs. Patterson and to 3 charities that William and I had supported over the years. Rebecca was written out completely, not out of spite, but out of clarity. She had made her choice, and I was making mine. My daughter would inherit nothing, because she had already shown me that nothing I had was of value to her anyway. The physical therapy was excruciating, but I pushed myself harder than the therapist recommended, because I was determined to walk again, to prove to myself if no one else that I wasn't ready to be warehoused and forgotten. 6 weeks after the surgery, I took my first unassisted steps across my living room, tears streaming down my face not from pain but from triumph. Mrs. Patterson clapped and cheered, and I thought about how this stranger had shown me more kindness and care than my own flesh and blood. Rebecca called a few times over the following months, Brief conversations where she asked how I was in that distracted tone that meant she wasn't really listening to the answer. I kept my responses short and polite, never mentioning the will, never giving her the satisfaction of knowing how deeply she had wounded me. Marcus's business was apparently doing very well. They were planning a European vacation. Everything in their life was perfect, pristine, untouched by the messy reality of aging parents and inconvenient obligations. Then, almost a year to the day after my surgery, Rebecca called in the middle of the night. Her voice was different, cracked and desperate in a way I had never heard before. Marcus had been arrested, something about financial fraud, embezzlement, schemes that had been running for years beneath the veneer of success. Their accounts were frozen. The house was being seized. Everything was gone, evaporated like morning mist under harsh sunlight. She was calling because she had nowhere else to turn, no one else to ask, coming back to the mother she had dismissed, and diminished only when she had exhausted every other option. I listened to her sob, listened to her explain how she had been deceived, how she hadn't known about Marcus's illegal activities, how she had lost everything. And I felt something inside me that was neither satisfaction nor sympathy, but rather a deep, tired sadness for all the years wasted, all the love squandered, all the chances we never took to be honest with each other. When she finally asked if she could come home, if she could stay with me just until she got back on her feet, I looked around my small living room, at William's empty chair, at the life I had rebuilt from nothing with the help of a neighbor who owed me nothing but gave me everything. "No, Rebecca," I said quietly. "You told me once, through Marcus's mouth, that you weren't my nurse, that I was a burden, that you had your own life to live. I respected that. I learned to live without you. I found people who actually cared whether I lived or died, who showed up when I needed them, who didn't see loving me as an inconvenience. You made your choice when I was broken and helpless on a couch, unable to walk, begging for my daughter's help. Now I'm making mine." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that contains the weight of all the words never spoken, all the apologies never offered, all the love taken for granted until it was gone. Finally Rebecca whispered, "Please, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And maybe she was. Maybe losing everything had finally taught her what truly mattered. But sorry doesn't heal years of neglect, doesn't erase the memory of lying helpless, while your only child couldn't spare the time to care. "I hope you find your way," I told her, and I meant it. "But you won't find it here." I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my living room, and for the first time since William died, I didn't feel alone. I felt free, unburdened by the fantasy of a daughter, who would somehow transform back into the child who loved me, released from the obligation to keep hoping for something that no longer existed. Mrs. Patterson found me there the next morning when she came by with breakfast, and she didn't ask why I had been crying. She just held my hand, and we sat together in the gentle morning light, two old women who had learned the hard way that family isn't always blood, and love isn't always permanent, but dignity, once you reclaim it, is yours to keep forever.